Good morning, everyone. Thank you all very much for joining us at back-to-back CRA client briefings. We are fortunate to do the work that we do at this point in South African and global history, that there's so much happening. Yesterday, we covered the latest budget, the third version of South Africa's budget this year. Today, we are going to unpack President Ramaphosa's meeting with President Trump in the Oval Office. What our reactions were to that, what are the key takeaways for South Africa? Was it a good meeting? Was it a bad meeting? We're going to try and connect the dots for you between what has led up to this moment. It's not in isolation. How does this link to South African domestic policy choices? And of course, how does it link to South Africa's foreign policy choices of the last 10 years, if not longer? And joining me to make sense of all of this, I have an all-star panel. We brought out the big guns for this particular discussion, starting with the CEO of the Institute of Race Relations, Dr. John Indres. We've got Terence Corrigan, Projects and Publications Manager at the Institute. And then finally, last but not least, Mr. Nicholas Lorimer, geopolitics researcher and host of the Daily Friend Show. Nick, one of the guests today, so for once he doesn't get to ask the questions, but we are all, us as panelists and or you in the audience are going to grill him and try and get him on the spot on these various issues. So just a bit of housekeeping before we start. This webinar is being recorded. If you, for any reason, have to drop off, you can always come back and watch the full discussion. If you have any questions, please post those in the comment box on the respective platform on which you're watching, and we will get to those throughout the discussion over the next hour or so. And then very lastly, if you are not yet a client of the CRA, then you can get in touch with me either during or after the discussion, and we will provide you with more information on that. But all protocol observed, all of the logistics and all of that out of the way. John, I'm going to start with you. Immediate thoughts from President Ramaphosa's meeting with President Trump. We were afforded 55 minutes at the very start of the engagement. I thought it was going to come later in the whole sort of 3, 4, 5 hour session, but we got it almost right off the bat as soon as the president and his cabinet colleagues were in the White House.
Yeah, what an utterly remarkable meeting. I was amazed to see how raucous the entire encounter was. To see President Ramaphosa and President Trump sitting on easy chairs in front of the, what is it, a fireplace, I think, maybe a mock fireplace. But the entire room being filled with journalists and ministers and hangers-on and the American vice president, everybody was there. And then to see the journalists shouting into the room, you know, Mr. President, talk about genocide, talk about this, talk about the other thing. What an amazing interaction it was. I think very contrary to what we usually expect to see in these kinds of encounters, which are very scripted, very formal. There's a sort of a certain way of interacting that is quite formulaic. But this wasn't like that at all. It was very spontaneous. And I think that Mr. Trump was in his element. You know, he's used to this. He does that quite a lot. He knows how to think on his feet, how to engage in dialogue, how to interrupt when he wants to get his point across, how to stick to his point and not be distracted. Whereas I think that for our president, Mr. Ramaphosa, this was quite a sobering, maybe also frightening experience, being right there in the limelight, in the spotlight, exposed to tough questions, not knowing what's coming next, and having to deal with all the challenges that were thrown at him. So it was a very, really remarkable event, I think, for us, very interesting to see it in South Africa. And the big takeaway for me would be that the South African delegation played credible defense to the US offense. They acquitted themselves well in the face of a really hostile interrogation and came away from it probably with a few bumps, scratches, and bruises, but not utterly vanquished. So there was no knockout landed, I think. Is that good or bad? Depends on how you look at it. I think one of the expectations was that this entire encounter would lead to greater pressure on the South African government to introduce the kinds of reforms that will produce economic growth in South Africa. And I think on that level, probably the encounter wasn't quite tough enough on the South Africans. But there were also behind closed doors meetings that we haven't had feedback on yet. it may well be that some of the issues that were conspicuously missing from the public meeting were discussed in the closed meetings. And it's also possible that the pressure was greater in those closed meetings even than at the public meeting. Chris.
Thanks very much, John. Mr. Corrigan, I'm coming to you next. And what you've also highlighted in some of your writing, I would like you to highlight just in your opening remarks now around how so much of this, if not most of it, was precipitated by South Africa's own domestic policy choices over the last 10 to 15 years. And also, of course, its foreign policy positioning. What happened yesterday on the 21st of May, it wasn't an isolation. It's not a random event that just came about, sort of, dropped out of the ether.
No, look, I really want to pull my hair out sometimes, and maybe then I'll have to wear a toupee like certain other world leaders. But there's an obsession with Donald Trump. I think that has personalized a lot of this around him. And I think that there is a certain type of commentator in our commentariat that is really loving it. This is your opportunity to get to fight Donald Trump directly. Not just comment on things that are happening in Milwaukee or San Francisco, but the real deal confrontation by a South African with the Great Orange Menace. Now, I think that's somewhat childish, and I think it's also incorrect. South Africa's foreign policy positioning for at least 20 years has been very hostile to the United States. I remember this is probably about 2008. There was a study I recall reading about voting congruence between the US and various countries around the world. And South Africa, I think, was one of the bottom 10. It was alongside places like Cuba, like North Korea, like Zimbabwe. Now, that in itself may not have been fatal, but it was also it was accompanied by a great deal of increasingly hostile rhetoric from the ANC and also from the South African state. You look at ANC documents. When Russia seized Crimea, for instance, this was portrayed as a defensive move against imperialism, which was all being coordinated by the demonic Americans, and democracy protests in Hong Kong could not possibly be because Hong Kong has actually wanted some sort of democracy, but because they were being manipulated. Speed up through that, you can go through things like the Black Lives Matter protest, where President Ramaphosa very ill-advisedly decided to do an address about how dreadful all this was, and racism in America and racism in South Africa are basically the same part of the continuum. The Russia-Ukraine war, the Lady R incident, and the ICJ case, and South Africa's relations with Iran. I think those last issues really broke the camel's back. So yes, South Africa has been positioning itself like this. That also may not have been fatal, but it was accompanied by the general decline and dissipation of the ability of the South African state to do anything. The state of your little Plataland dorpies that can't reticulate water is directly connected to the fact that we have embassies that don't have trade counselors, that we have embassies in East Asia that can't print visas because they don't have printing materials, and the fact that we have this monstrously large embassy in Washington that has virtually no exposure to any kind of vector of influence because it just doesn't try. The sending Ibrahim Rasool, who had made some very intemperate comments about Trump personally over the years, and he was also very much associated with the kind of Palestinian cause and event sympathy for the more Islamist elements of it. It was just a very, very, very foolish decision to make. And yes, I think that all sort of yes, in the question of Santon Drive, explicitly we want to make this bombastic gesture to stick it in America's eye. It's Yeah, I think there is probably a great deal to criticize in American foreign policy, and I think there's a great deal to criticize with Donald Trump personally, etc., etc. But it cannot be gainsaid that South Africa has positioned itself without the skills to manage it, and that for me is critical. And I think we saw a lot of that coming to fruition yesterday.
Nicholas, coming to you next. You yesterday we spoke after the media meeting in front of the cameras, and you highlighted how, in a way, this was quite a South African solution where you had so many different players in the room. So you, of course, had the official government delegation, but then you had two major winning golfers, Ernie Els and Retief Goosen, and of course, Johan Rupert. So just in your opening remarks, your reactions, and do you think we at the CRA, we've been putting out over the last 6 months or so this idea that with engaging with Trump does require some kind of more imaginative diplomacy, maybe some unconventional diplomacy. Do you think at least in that regard, President Ramaphosa and his cabinet colleagues, they got some of that right to try and lean on people like Retief Goosen and anyone else to get them in the room, and once they're in the room, maybe deflate some of the more angry-filled comments that could have come their way, anger-filled.
So I'm not sure where even to start, because I think there's so much to be said. Look, maybe it's just my own twisted sense of humor, but I was rather amused by the sort of spectacle yesterday, particularly Trump sort of bludgeoning on in one direction, while Ramaphosa looked increasingly uncomfortable. On a sort of human level, I thought that was quite amusing. But there was something kind of beautifully South African about the whole thing. Our delegation really came across to me as quite sort of hodgepodge with no one really on the same page. You had President Ramaphosa, who just wanted to get through the whole thing with as little drama as possible. You had John Steenhuisen, who was there trying to make it look like he was strong, but also supportive. He was trying to do this whole balancing act of putting pressure on Ramaphosa, but at the same time not looking like he was selling out the country. You had Zingiswa Lozi, the president of COSATU, trying to sort of, on one hand, saying the Americans must do domestic investment, but then also saying, no, but you know what, Mr. Trump, we're actually treating these farmers too nice. We're paying them too much for their farms. You had Rupert, who was very clearly interested in Starlink, taking a random swipe at John Steenhuisen halfway through the discussion, sort of implying he was responsible for crime in the Western Cape. You had Ernie Els, who was kind of, I think, just there on sort of patriotic feeling and wanting everything to go well and the meeting to be a success. And from some of the reporting, it seems like he was actually the main mover and shaker behind this meeting, which is, I think, kind of, highlights Terence's point about how our official diplomatic capacity doesn't really exist. But luckily, we have these sort of informal channels in this case, which helped us out. And yet, despite the fact that all of the South Africans in that delegation were clearly not on the same page, clearly had completely different agendas, and were all kind of sort of slightly hostile to each other, they all, in the end, sort of pulled in the same direction, trying to defend the country, which I thought was kind of a beautiful metaphor for sometimes how South Africa can come together, despite all of its very many problems. But yeah, it was. I'm still skeptical as to whether we're going to see much concrete coming out of this meeting. There was, it was so sort of raucous and chaotic and so much lack of focus. You had like Ernie Els being asked randomly by Trump, "Oh, what do you think about this?" which was quite interesting. It was exactly as John said, one of these kind of moments of breaking down the diplomatic niceties. But I think it actually kind of turned out quite well for us in the end, with the fact that he had his passport and that kind of thing. But yeah, it was a moment, I think, where Ramaphosa was. It was. So I often talk about the ANC as having and Terence was just describing some of it there, the two-faced diplomacy towards the US, where the official approach is, towards the US. Oh, we want to develop trade relations. We're economic partners. We value the US's input. And then to a domestic audience, the ANC will say, well, you know, we're going to drive the imperialist dogs into the sea and viva the revolution, etc., etc. And kind of you saw the culmination of it here in this meeting, where Ramaphosa sort of, for a moment, pretended like he was some sort of non-racial liberal. Like, what? Kill the Boer? Never heard of it. What? That's terrible. We condemned that so much, even though his government has been much less, you know, aggressive in condemning these things, and throwing Malema under the bus. Oh, he's just some small party, you know, it's got nothing to do with us. It's completely counter our policy. It was hilarious how quickly he sort of just sort of threw all the ANC niceties and domestic rhetoric under the bus and tried to come across as this like magnanimous sweet leader. I don't think it really worked, but you know, it was rather amusing to watch. And then also a very funny dynamic was, and I think this is an interesting aspect for what it might do for the relationship in the GNU, was feeling under the pressure and clearly not feeling very comfortable. He sort of did this kind of hospital rugby pass to John Steenhuisen saying, my Minister of Agriculture can answer that question, just desperately trying to bring him into the conversation. It was quite an interesting spectacle. And I think it said a lot more about South Africa, really, actually, I think, than necessarily our relationship with the US. I don't know if those are very organized thoughts, but that was my take.
If I can come in there, Chris, is
Please.
just to continue on this intervention of John Steenhuisen, because I thought that was a really interesting moment. You call it a hospital rugby pass, Nicholas. I think that's not wrong, but I do think that Steenhuisen caught the ball, and he did something useful with it. You know, so he was quick on his feet. He found a clever response to it, and that response might have repercussions into the future in our politics, because what he did was create a two camps narrative, where one camp is the decent people in the ANC and the DA, and the other camp is the crazy rabble outside that you saw on the video. And he points to the video screen, you know, the EFF and MK, saying, we are not like them. Those are the crazy people. Those are the ones who must be kept away from power. And I do wonder if that makes it more difficult for those parties inside the ANC that are favoring a relationship with the EFF to push that forward, because now the glare of attention is on the dangers inherent in such a link-up, a tie-up, and maybe it makes it more difficult for an ANC-EFF coalition to come about, potentially. So I thought that was a really interesting moment. It was also funny, as you said, that Ramaphosa, as he was passing the ball on, couldn't help but point out, and he's white. You know, I've brought my Minister of Agriculture, who is white. So I think pandering to what he thought were Donald Trump's racial prejudices, but I think inappropriately so. But it was still amusing. Chris.
Terence, I saw you unmuted.
Yeah.
Please.
Look, yeah, you know, I what I took away from this, and let me just say, I found watching it excruciatingly uncomfortable. Now, I challenge to find many people who have been more critical of President Ramaphosa and the ruinous policy agenda that he has driven than I. But I can feel sympathy for somebody who is put in what must be a kind of pins and needles, you know, bed of nails position. And I think that was kind of what he faced. You know, the ANC has, as Nicholas correctly said, you know, spoken to different audiences with almost contradictory messages. We are the rainbow nation of God, everyone equal before the sun. We abhor racism. We're a constitutional democracy versus, you know, white colonizers, etc., etc., etc. He's correct, though, that Malema is not part of the government, and that is reasonable enough. I think, though, what this does do is that it shines a light on the pathologies of some of our political culture. Malema may not be a member of the ANC, but this mode of politics was fostered in the ANC. Ronald Lamola, people, you know, sometimes brought up that as I think as either head or deputy head of the ANC Youth League said that unless farmers give up their land, the Van Tondas and Van der Merwes, we can't guarantee their safety. Okay, and this is now our foreign minister. It's also important to bear in mind that President Ramaphosa has steadfastly refused to condemn this sort of rhetoric. Now, let me be clear here. I am not saying that things should be banned or prohibited or anything like that. That's a somewhat separate conversation, but that's not what I'm getting at. I think, though, that if you are serious about constitutional democracy, if you are serious about common citizenships, non-racism and everything, it may be okay to, one can maybe have an argument about race-based policy or whatever. I've got my own opinions about that. But something that references violence and violence directed at a particular audience, no, that's really not a difficult thing to do. But I think that unfortunately the ANC has simply been too locked into its conception of itself as a revolutionary organization. And yesterday, President Ramaphosa was forced to confront the fact that this isn't something that goes unnoticed elsewhere. And I think if anything good can come out of this, perhaps that is something that maybe he has to decide: is the ANC a modern political party that accepts the principle of common citizenship for all in a diverse population? Or is it some sort of ethno-nationalist, revolutionary group? You can be one or the other. You can't be both.
Thanks, Terence. John, I'm going to come back to you. We've got lots of comments and one or two questions here and there. Thank you, everyone, again for joining us this morning as we react to President Ramaphosa's meeting with President Trump. Yeah, any questions you might have, please put those in the comment section. We'll get to those as we can throughout the discussion. John, I'm just going to come to you in terms of any thoughts you might have around, I'm hoping that President Ramaphosa and his colleagues had some kind of target with this meeting. So whether that's short-term, medium-term, or long-term, some kind of success metrics. I don't want to say KPIs and be too corporate, but some idea around, look, there are going to be narrative points that they don't agree with. How do you diffuse those? But what are you trying to attain in terms of investment, trade, relations, those kinds of things? Do you think they had any of those goals or targets in mind? And if so, are there any that you think they move the needle closer towards? Because I think it's also important to not see this meeting in isolation. I will only consider it a success or a failure based on how South Africa now follows up from this, and if they use some of the openings that they were afforded.
Yeah, so from the public meeting, we didn't get many specifics. I think one thing we could read into it was, despite the very diverse nature of our representation, that many of them, if not all of them, did mention economic growth. And I thought that was good. That is sort of the thing that South Africa really needs. But I also had the impression that the way they spoke about growth was also unspecific and vague. Even when Mr. Ramaphosa spoke about it, he said, like, we need growth and investment, but it didn't feel like the sense of urgency about having to make tough choices has sunk in yet. And that is what needs to sink in ultimately for the economy to grow. I thought it was also noteworthy that Mr. Ramaphosa spoke about the need for jobs to reduce crime. So that is the direction of causality that he chose to emphasize. He said if more people are working, then they've got less reason.
I think John might. Here we go. We're back.
Yeah, if more people are working, then there's less reason for people to commit crime. But of course, the causality also goes the other direction. If there's a lot of crime about, then there's less investment and there are fewer jobs. So you've got to address the crime problem if you want to achieve economic growth. That's really important. So there, I thought there might have been KPIs in the background, but I don't think there were. There probably were some KPIs in the closed meetings when the trade ministers talked to one another, and they would have said, let's increase agricultural exports by X. Let's ease motor vehicle component imports by whatever number. I think that would have been handled at a lower level. Maybe we'll get some reporting out of that, as we get sort of official announcements on collaboration or strategic deals. I think at the public level, the main point was to establish, if not rapport, then at least enough of a common ground for other conversations to move forwards. And the rapport was slightly there, but I had the impression that President Trump was quite adamant about not letting the South Africans get away with fudging issues. In a way, an analogy that comes to mind is that when you have a new young dog and it makes a mess in your house, what some people will do is that they'll rub the dog's nose into the mess that the dog has made to dissuade it from doing it in the future. The rug is South Africa, and there's sort of little piles of unemployment, crime, no growth, no investment all over the rug. And what Trump did was to use the opportunity to rub the ANC's nose in its failures. And he did that again and again and did not let them get away with trying to pretend that there wasn't a problem. And that is a useful role to play, because there is the problem in South Africa with not acknowledging the state of the country, not acknowledging the hard choices that need to be made to get us onto a better track. And it takes some really rough action, like President Trump demonstrated, to focus attention on the real problems that exist. And another observation, I'm not sure if I believe this myself yet, but maybe it's true, which is that both Mr. Trump and Mr. Ramaphosa told untruths during this meeting. They both lied. They said things that aren't correct. But in a sense, Mr. Trump's untruths are ones that bring you closer towards the truth, that move you towards the truth, whereas Mr. Ramaphosa's untruths move you away from the truth. So when Mr. Ramaphosa was saying, in the United States, you've got expropriation laws like we've got, it's basically exactly the same thing. That was an untruth, and it's one that takes you away from understanding the reality of what's going on. When Mr. Trump was saying white genocide, murder problems, he is pointing to a problem that is a real problem, which is 26,000 people murdered per year in South Africa, which incidentally, I don't know if you caught it, they spoke about Russia and Ukraine as well. Trump said, what I want to do is save lives. Currently, 5,000 soldiers are being killed per week in that conflict on both sides. Multiply 5,000 by 50 weeks per year, that's around 25,000. That's 250,000 deaths. So the number of people being killed in Ukraine and Russia and in South Africa is very significant. It deserves to be addressed. It should be reduced. And that is something that deserves to have attention drawn to it. Chris.
Thanks, John. Nick, I'm going to come back to you. In terms of maybe some next steps, as it were, give us a program of action. What would build on this? Let's assume this was good for a kind of reset. Is it getting President Trump to attend the G20 summit in November? Is there something else that South Africa can really drill down and focus in on now to get at least the trade and investment case stronger?
It's so I think part of the problem here is exactly what Terence is talking about, which is that the problem is quite fundamental in the way that the ANC, which is still, despite the GNU clutching onto the power over foreign policy, as though it's one of its most beloved children, and the ANC's just general approach here is really, really poor. I wonder how much attention this issue is going to get from Trump specifically, but there are many groups and factions within the US government, and I'm sure some of them are quite interested in some sort of concession from South Africa, probably relating to tariffs on vehicles or something like that. I think that South Africa's best approach now is to... So there's, what was this good for Ramaphosa? Probably somewhat domestically. I think it united some people behind him. I think there'll probably be a bit of a nationalist sentiment that probably helps Ramaphosa out a bit in this, even though I don't think he deserves it, particularly because I don't think his performance was amazing in that meeting. I think what South Africa would really need to do is make some real economic changes. It needs to make just a generally more favorable business environment. What I'm worried will happen is that South Africa will make very specific, limited concessions to the US. They will say, okay, we will let Starlink in, which is a good thing. We definitely want Starlink in this country, but they will confine it. They will draw the circle around Starlink and say, but no other businesses get these rules. Or they'll say, we'll drop all the tariffs on Tesla vehicles specifically, or we'll drop all the tariffs on only American companies, which would also be a step in the right direction for sure. But it's really not, what we need is actually a far more broad, comprehensive package of economic reform. So I think it depends, what is the next step for success here. If you're talking about Ramaphosa, I think it's to try and just forget that all of this ever happened. If you're talking about the ANC, it's also to just sort of bury this. But if you're talking about what the country really needs, what we really need is a comprehensive set of economic reforms. But unfortunately, that's the answer to so many of the issues that we have right now, that government really needs to embrace those economic reforms if we're going to get anywhere. And this kind of stuff, the only reason we were there in the first place was because our economic position is so weak. The fact that we are so traumatized by the idea of losing major business with the US is precisely because we have almost no economic growth. And so really this was, in this meeting, and the fact that we were there, all of the things that were being said, it really is the culmination of years and years of policy failure, both on a foreign policy front and on a domestic policy front.
Thanks, Nicholas. Terence, I'm going to come to you now to add to that, but I also want to ask you, you write a lot on foreign policy and geopolitical matters. When one talks about sort of trying to capture the narrative from one's own point of view and your own agenda, do you consider that from that point of view that President Ramaphosa and his colleagues did some measure of impactful and good work, or not necessarily? So please add to what Nicholas said. Maybe
yeah. Look, I just want to make the point that we also talking about economic growth, but almost in the abstract. We need growth, we need investment, we need jobs. We don't actually intend to do anything to actually make them happen. But if only we, if only we could get Harry Potter or Hermione Granger to come over and wave a wand, and I'm not sure what the Hogwarts spell is, but that it's this kind of magical thinking idea. Yeah, I mean, I would like to. I found it almost surreal to see the COSATU representative saying we need foreign investment from the United States. These are people whose views on the United States are more hostile than the ANC's. They basically don't like employers, don't like business, don't like investors. And, they certainly do like things like rigid labor laws, high minimum wages, skills development levies, wealth taxes, and all the rest. So which is it? We'd like these things, but, it's a deal breaker if we give anything. So, it just is a phrase which I think it describes so much of South Africa. We're not serious. Capturing the narrative. I think people who went in sort of sympathetic to Team SA and went into sympathetic to Team MAGA probably both felt that they'd been vindicated. I think for me the positive outcome of this wasn't whether anything was actually being achieved. My intuition is that this is probably about as good as we could reasonably hope for. That there was going to be this kind of ambush, which I don't really think was an ambush. I think it was a kind of frontal assault that everyone should have seen coming from a mile away. I suppose it was quite impressive that he had a video teed up. But this is the way Donald Trump operates, and don't get all huffy and hurt acting about it when he's done it before.
Sorry, can I just jump in on that point that Terence just made? Exactly right. Ambush implies that you couldn't see this coming. This was like a giant neon beacon. You could tell that something like this was going to happen. I think the South African delegation, the moment they saw the White House staff wheeling TVs into the room, probably should have felt that something was up. I agree completely with Terence's characterization.
Yeah, this was Texas Chainsaw Massacre, not Jack the Ripper. And I imagine Texas Chainsaw Massacre is more popular with a mega base, but I digress. Okay, point is, I think though that if what we're hearing is correct, at least they're going to keep talking, and I think that was about as good as it was going to get. I didn't think anything concrete was going to come out of this, but I thought it could have gone a hell of a lot worse. It could have ended up with, well, I don't see any point in talking anymore, and come back later or come back next year. So there is a chance to salvage something. I suspect that there are people who are inclined on either team who would probably at least think that there is some sort of dialogue happening. So even if you haven't shifted opinions, at least you've shown that there may be some points that where some sort of a transactional connection can develop. So look, but as with so much of what I think has gone wrong in South Africa, there is this dread obeisance to ideology. Can the ANC dial back the anti-US rhetoric, even if not the voting record at the UN? I'm not sure. Can Ramaphosa find it in himself to actually, say in Parliament, we reject and we condemn the chanting of "Kill the Boer"? Not because AfriForum doesn't like it, but because those are sentiments that have no place in a constitutional democracy. Mr. Terence seems like he's some kind of movie maniac. I have watched a number of Jack the Ripper movies, and I've seen the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. I actually thought the remake was a little bit better. So that would be those would be my thoughts on this issue.
Thank you, Terence. John, I'm going to come to you next. We have had a lot of comments and some questions. So thank you all very much for taking the time. John, I just want to highlight one question specifically. The South African case against Israel at the ICJ. When this was raised to President Trump, he, I'm paraphrasing, but he said, I don't know what I want on that. I don't know how that's going to be sort of solved, as it were. He sort of moved on from that quite quickly. That, in our assessment, that has been one of the driving, not the main, but it has been one of the major driving issues in this deterioration of South Africa-US relations. What do you think might happen with that case now? And also linked to that, South Africa's relationships, diplomatic and otherwise, with the country of the government in Iran.
So I'm not seeing any signs of a shift on the South African side, but I do get the impression that possibly the US administration's hostility towards South Africa is I was saying that South Africa's that the US administration's hostility towards South Africa is greater than what we saw yesterday at that meeting. And that may also be true on the question of Israel and the ICJ case. Not seeing much of a sign of a shift in South Africa's position there currently. Maybe we'll see something happening, but for now, I think South Africa's going to maintain its course. But I think there's a lot of unhappiness in the United States with South Africa's positions, and they would certainly appreciate some sign of acknowledgement of that or movement towards a less confrontative relationship with close allies of the United States.
Terence, please.
Yeah, look, I think that this is central to the breakdown. South Africa's relationship, it's already hearing to talk about South Africa's trade with China. That's not a concern. I think it's also not entirely not entirely accurate to say that that the US demands that South Africa like dissociate itself from Russia and China. Those are global powers. You kind of can't avoid them. The point about Iran, though, is that it's a discretionary relationship. It's not one we have a huge economic links with. We at least nominally don't have values in common, but it's one that has taken up a surprising amount of South African diplomatic bandwidth. I think a lot of that goes into a sort of policy capture that's happened at Durko, where, Middle Eastern issues, the Palestinian cause and whatever, has just sort of overwhelmed everything else. Everyone knows what our position is on Palestine. Does anybody know what our position is on Mozambique's election? I don't think so. And Mozambique is literally, you could drive across the border. And we have however many hundreds of thousands of Mozambicans living here. Point is, that is a much, the structure of our diplomacy is misaligned. And I don't think that this is going down well in America, because South Africa is showing something about where its heart, if you like, lies. The ICJ case, I think that this, without getting into the merits of the case, an adverse finding against Israel could be very near existential for it. And I suspect that has something to do with the claims of genocide against South Africa, or, that's Trump's response, knocking South Africa off the moral perch it's occupied, and, from which it has launched this. But once again, I come back to my first comment. You want to take on Israel, which has a very powerful patron. Okay, that's fine. What influences do you have to maybe mitigate the fallout? Spain, Malaysia, Norway, Belgium, all these other countries that have also kind of been sympathetic in this respect and have joined the court case, Ireland, all of them can play some other card. South Africa is just the one that can't. And it's the one that kind of rushed in head first. My sense of it is that issue was not discussed up front, because that was one that they were saving for a very serious discussion inside. And I think the white farmers, the genocide, that gets gets everyone excited, and I think he knows how incendiary that is, and he's stretching truth a bit, so that can get people angry, excited, and foreign policy, I think, is a much deeper, more fundamental, and more structural problem, and I think probably a lot more damaging to South Africa if it's not resolved.
John, I'm going to come to you, and then Nick straight after. Just on this, I want to highlight something that President Trump mentioned around foreign aid, and I'll get to why I'm asking this question. So if you take out the relationship between South Africa and the US, I think South Africa, globally and domestically, given our low growth, given global volatility, this is the rainy day that we should have been saving for, and it's the rainy day for which we should have been preparing with our policy choices. When we talk about things like foreign aid, President Trump, he mentioned that his administration's cuts to USAID, to those programs, have been quote unquote devastating. Hopefully a lot of people are going to start spending a lot of money. I've talked to other nations. We want them to chip in and spend money too, and we've spent a lot. It's big. It's a tremendous problem going on in many countries. I think he's hitting on something that we've highlighted here, where this administration particularly wants to partner with countries that have their own house in order, that take responsibility domestically, that are more active role players in their region. So the caricature is that America first is very literally applied. I think it's America first, not necessarily America alone. South Africa has within its ability to be one of those partners to the US for that relationship, but also for its relationship with other countries, to not be dependent on them for aid and investment completely, and to just sort of be reliant on them. What do you think of that opportunity, and how one can take advantage of that kind of thing?
Yeah, again, I think that's a really good point. I thought one of the revealing remarks that President Trump made was when speaking to the golfers, he said, "We respect champions." And I think that is true not just for the sporting realm, but also for relationship with other countries. And I think that for the United States, under Trump, it is far more desirable to interact with other nations that are successful, that are productive, that have high output, that build wealth for their citizens, that are authorities in their area. And South Africa isn't ticking these boxes. We're not presenting ourselves as champions. Even if you look at some of the asks that were coming out of the delegation, it seemed very subservient. It was, dear Mr. Trump, we can't fix our crime problem. We need your help. Please give us your technology. Give us Starlink. Give us drones. Support us. And it's not a very strong position to present. So I think you're right. When it comes to development aid and USAID and all of those programs, what Trump is looking for is really countries that sort out their own problems, that get onto a growth track, that demonstrate capabilities, that they're able to do things and get things done. And I don't think he's got much respect for countries that don't do that. So again, this is another message to our government to sort itself out, to clean up its act, clean its own house, get things in order, and then it will be a far more interesting partner to the United States than it currently is. Chris.
Nick, sorry, I'm going to break my promise to you. I said I was going to come to you next, but I did see Terence raise his hand, so sorry.
If I can just interject with a bit of historical background there. America has kind of been the guarantor of, let's call it, the free world, and then the world order, subsequently. It's also had a lot of very high profile and damaging policy reversals, and all of these have one thing in common, is that the areas where they were trying to sort of let's say support allies, those allies weren't really willing to do the job for themselves, or did it ineptly. I'm thinking of South Vietnam, although right at the end, actually, it was a completely different country, and they could possibly have held on with American support. I'm thinking of Iraq. I'm thinking of Afghanistan. If you look at countries where American blood and treasure has actually resulted in strong allies, think of West Germany, think of South Korea. Those are countries that accepted American support, and but also built their own capacity to take care of themselves. South Korea in 1950 had an economy that was smaller than Zambia's. Now, just in military terms, they produce a wonderful tank called the K2 Panther that can pretty much shoot anything out. But that's just my interest. Sorry. So I think this is Trump being transactional, but also in a sense being realistic. I don't particularly care if you're a democracy, but I do want you to be, to be self-sufficient. Then maybe we can talk about how we help you.
Nick, I'm going to come to you if you would like to comment on the sort of foreign aid and other opportunities for South Africa to be more proactive. But I also want to ask you specifically just around how you would think, if we accept the sort of art of the deal methodology, do you think that both countries can take some win from applying that to this meeting, from both the American side and from the South African side, where maybe you try and get something across the board, at least in terms of what your priorities are, and you have to give up some other concessions, because that is part of deal making, right?
I definitely think there's room for stuff to happen, and you can see it now. The sort of gears are turning. There's some reporting on what the actual trade negotiations that may take place were. That was, and I think probably the most important meeting was the one we didn't see. It wasn't even necessarily the one that happened after between the presidents, but the meeting that happened between Parks Tao and the American trade advisors. And I think there's definitely room there for South Africa to, at least, because I think Trump is very keen on he loves headlines. He's an entertainment guy, he likes spectacle, that kind of thing. And I think if South Africa is seen to make some kind of very American business friendly concession to the Americans, Trump would like that, and the South Africa will benefit because we are overregulated now. As I said earlier, I think those rules for business shouldn't just apply to American companies. It should be far more widespread. But that's still, I think, a very good starting point. to get things rolling. So there's definitely room for some sort of South Africa can I think if Ramaphosa is interested in actually growing the economy, he can make a real concession here, and then he can go and he can talk to the radicals in the ANC, who he seems very obsessed with appeasing, even though they don't represent most of the country. And you can say, guys, I didn't have a choice. I had to deregulate. I had to make exemptions to BEE here because otherwise we were going to have all these problems with the Americans. And it's what's the phrase the ANC used to describe the GNU? A strategic retreat, but ultimately for the good of the revolution. This is a case that Ramaphosa could make within his own party, and he should seize this opportunity to do so. But I'm somewhat skeptical that he will. I think the true story of this meeting is really only going to be understood in the weeks ahead as we see whether we do avoid the 30% tariffs that the US has paused on us. Then we can, in the fullness of time, we'll be able to properly analyze this. Right now, I think it's a little bit murky to say how important this actually was, apart from, the spectacle.
I'm glad you highlighted the tariff point. Of course, the next deadline is the 9th of July. And I think for countries like South Africa, whether they can secure some kind of concession or deal on that,
sorry, just one more thing I actually want to add. I don't think aid or anything really, at least under this administration, is going to return. And I don't think even if we sign some amazing trade deal with the US, it will return. The turn in the against aid and even trade to some extent in the Republican Party is a much more general one within the US. It's not like South Africa is being singled out. Aid was stopped to countries all over Africa, and I think that you're sort of playing around in that paradigm, at least while Trump is in office, and possibly while the Republicans is in office, is not necessarily going to be very South Africa shouldn't expect PEPFAR to come back. I don't think shouldn't expect AGOA to come back, at least under this administration. So just kind of put that all in the past and stop looking for restoration and just see what new we can get out of it.
On that point, also, I mean, on the part of the GNU and future governments, I also don't think they should put all their eggs in, for example, a Democrat administration or government coming in. I'm seeing strains of more isolationism across parties and wanting different relationships with allies and enemies around the world of America. So South Africa shouldn't just hunker down and think within 4 years' time it's all hunky-dory, moonshine and roses. Again, if we talk about risk management and planning for the long term, that would not be the kind of thing I would advise the government to do. John, you wanted to highlight one of the comments from one of our viewers. I also wanted to ask you, I'm not sure which question you're going to highlight, but if you could just comment a little bit on what we saw yesterday from the South African side linked to regular polling that the Institute conducts yearly that shows us what South Africans' preferences are, especially what they want in terms of their government to pursue in terms of policy and trying to unlock growth. Do you think some of those messages, we're seeing elements of that in South Africa's public global engagements or not just yet?
Yeah, I can sort of link those two things together. So the viewer comment that I'm want to talk about is by Moyo, who said, Cyril didn't attempt to capture the message and narrate an alternative perspective. He should have been prepared with a story that recaptures the imagination of racial relations in South Africa. And I think that's a really good point. It's one of the things that was missing from the interaction, which was what was Mr. Ramaphosa selling? What is the pitch he was making for South Africa? And there really wasn't much of a pitch. It was all defense, trying to fend off the thrusts that were coming from Mr. Trump. But what was lacking was to say, well, South Africa is actually a pretty interesting country. It's a pretty useful country with potential. Nick?
Sorry, just to comment on that one. Exactly, John, I 100% agree. Panically saying, but my Minister of Agriculture is white is not really a great sort of narrative message about South Africa and how its race relations.
Exactly, yes. And the thing is that our polling does reveal that ordinary South Africans have mostly moderate values. And when we ask them what the top two priorities are that they would like to see being addressed by the government, the top priority consistently for over 10 years in our polling has been jobs and unemployment. With an unemployment rate of over 40% on the expanded definition, no wonder. This affects many people in their daily lives. It affects families. It affects everybody in South Africa. And that is what needs to be solved. And that needs a vision, an idea of how to get there. And what we see in our polling also is that many of the policies, the anti-growth policies that are coming out of the ANC are not supported by the majority of the population. So if you ask South Africans, do you support the Expropriation Act? 68% of people don't support it. If you ask them about merit-based appointments in the civil service or to jobs, 80%, give or take, want people to be appointed on the basis of merit, not on the basis of skin color. If you ask people about preferential procurement and you say, do you prefer for the government to use its public procurement for black empowerment, or do you want the government to spend money on a value for money basis and avoid overspending on what it buys on behalf of the public? Then again, around 80% of people say, please give us value for money procurement. We need to make sure that the tax money that is being contributed by all of us is being spent well, and that we don't overspend on what we're buying as a state. So overall, South Africans are moderate. They've got sensible attitudes about their priorities, about policies, and we are, I think, gradually beginning to see this be reflected in the political space. So currently, what the ANC is selling is not what voters are buying. And as long as that disconnect remains in place, support for the ANC will continue to decline. And as an aside, that also remains true if there should be an alliance between the ANC and the EFF or MK, because those parties also are selling things which voters are not buying. The entire political spectrum needs to shift its attention towards growth promoting, job creating policies. That is in the interest of every single party in South Africa, for their own sakes, but also for the sake of the country.
Thank you, John. We are going to start to wrap up as we head towards our hour mark here. So I'm going to ask the three of you to give us some parting thoughts, maybe some parting advice for the GNU, but also if anyone wants to tackle this, some parting advice for businesses in South Africa as to how they take what happened yesterday and now try and factor this into some of their medium to long-term planning. I know that's a very big point, a very big question. One example I could think of, for example, is for our auto sector, auto industry. Don't put all of your eggs in the AGOA basket. Don't think now that if you thought from an optics point of view yesterday went well, that AGOA is going to be renewed and that therefore you will be fine in terms of your exports, etc. I don't think that's the most proactive way to go about the current geopolitical and trade moment. But let's go around the room. Terence, start with you. Any final thoughts?
My final thought is that I think that we have to resign ourselves to an important reality, and that is that a good relationship between the United States and South Africa is off the table. I think that was squandered has been squandered over 20 years. I do think, though, that the good news is that yesterday probably showed that there is a possibility of a reset on a transactional basis. I think that we need a great deal more pragmatism and a great deal less ideology infusing the way South Africa operates. I also think that domestic commentators would do well not to adopt the fallacy of reductio ad Trumpium, reducing everything to Trump. South Africa's relationship is not bad because you have a mercurial figure in the White House. And it is also, I think, important to bear in mind that much of what ails South Africa would ail South Africa without Trump and without any of his criticism of it. So I think that if South Africa wants the growth, if South Africa wants the constitutional democracy and the moral legitimacy that comes with it, then it needs to do things differently. Once again, this is not to please the United States, not to please Donald Trump. It is simply what is in the country's what is in the country's interests, and I'll leave it there.
Very good. Thanks, Terence. Nick, come to you next.
Yeah, I just want to sort of echo a lot of what Terence was saying there. I think as long as the ANC holds on to DIRCO, and unless it significantly reforms itself internally, as in, it drops this messianic thing, there's just no possibility of a particularly good relationship. I'm even skeptical to some degree of what that we can even have an amazing transactional relationship. I think South Africa's sort of economic investment position is so weak at the moment. There's so many exemptions that would be needed that would have to be granted to South African companies to truly make that relationship a thriving one, that I don't think are particularly likely to happen anytime soon. So if you're a business in South Africa, I think assume that things are going to be, at least with regards to the US, tough for a while to come. Just to add to also what Terence was saying about how this is not just about Trump, the serious deterioration in relations between South Africa and America, while it's accelerated under Trump, very much began under the Biden administration, actually, who were, the Democratic Party was trying to balance their anti and pro-Israel factions, and then South Africa brought the genocide case, which I think for the Biden White House was a huge headache. It was an issue they didn't want to talk about, and now suddenly they had to have a particular opinion on it. There was the Lady R incident, which was a very public rebuke of South Africa by a U.S. ambassador. These are much deeper issues, and they represent quite frankly a bipartisan consensus. Now we'll see. Maybe that will change a little bit now, because American politics is so sort of partisan. You can already see, Americans who are anti-Trump, who can't find South Africa on a map, talking about how Ramaphosa was the greatest statesman in the world during that meeting. And likewise, you see sort of pro-Trump people saying that, this was the greatest smackdown to make smackdowns great again in diplomatic history. So maybe perceptions on South Africa will change. Maybe, I don't know, President AOC in 2029 will embrace South Africa warmly, but I'd rather doubt it. So medium term, don't expect this relationship to improve until the fundamental dynamics of South Africa change. Either the ANC changes itself significantly, or our politics changes so that the ANC is no longer in government, at which point we will develop a new relationship with the US.
If I could just chip in, my sense is that even President AOC would not be acceptable to the ANC.
Probably not, no.
Very likely not. Thanks, Nick. John, last word from your side.
Yeah, closing thoughts. I think the ball is in our court as South Africans, and that we need to make the choices ultimately. And something that would be recognized and I think respected by the United States is some progress of whatever form on the issues that have been raised by that administration. Yesterday at that public meeting, the issue was very much crime, the high murder rate, and that is something that has to be addressed for the country to make progress. So let's show some movement on that. If we want to rebuild our relationship with the United States, let's show that we are capable of protecting the lives, the property of South Africans. That is such a basic thing. It's indisputable. It has to happen. So let's get working on that. And I think if we do that, then there's a chance of improving the relationship. We can't do it on the basis of words only. Resetting the relationship, by through smooth talking, I think is not going to work with this administration. You've got to show results. So let's do that. Is what my advice would be to the South African government.
I think that's a good note. Thank you, John, on which to end. I think, yeah, those countries and jurisdictions in this current geopolitical moment who get their domestic house in order from a policy point of view, from a legislation point of view, they're going to benefit from the uncertainty that is now generated by Trump and by other countries around the world. That's the reality. It doesn't help labeling him and his colleagues as certain things. That's what you're going to have to deal with. So when you get your own house in order, you just equip your people, you make it more conducive for investment and for job creation in your country, and that places you in a much stronger and I think credible position in global geopolitics. But on that note, we're going to end. To the three of you, Nick, John, Terence, thank you very much for your time and your expertise this morning. To all of you who made time to join us for this discussion, thank you very much. To all of our CRA clients, thank you very much for your valued support. To those of you who are not yet CRA clients, we trust you will sign up after this discussion, and we look forward to any follow-up questions or requests for information that you might have. We will have much more in terms of reports, briefings, other analysis on this particular topic, and much more on South African economics, on the state of our society, on politics, and of course, global matters going forward. To have access to all of that, we encourage you to become a CRA client today. Thank you, everyone, for your time. We'll all chat very soon in the next CRA briefing discussion. Until next time, this has been Chris Hutton for the Center for Risk Analysis. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.